Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to get some breakfast in, get some squats going. And I thought I'd talk with you guys today about functional exercises, because this is a big point of contention out there, because you have a whole functional fitness movement. You have people who use this term, but it's really an ambiguous term, and it's something that we should probably define a little more clearly. And I think because of a number of factors, it's always going to be a gray area. But and people will pick on that word because it doesn't really mean anything. And that's true until you start to define it. And I guess I'll give you guys kind of my take on what that means. Because obviously we'd say things like, well, obviously an exercise that would carry over to sports or something, that would be a functional exercise. Well, that's still pretty ambiguous because then you've got sports specificity. So what I would say is that functional exercises are exercises in which you load a normal movement pattern. In other words, movement patterns that are just part of our normal day-to-day movement patterns that we would do in intense labor, struggles, sports, things like that, in which you can load a very similar movement pattern in a way that's going to produce a strength curve similar to what we would produce against gravity or an object or anything else. And that's where it gets interesting, because we can really look at that from the perspective of, what does that mean? Well, that would basically be anything that you don't have to design a special machine to do. In other words, you have exercises out there that create an unnormal and unnatural movement pattern. I mean, we can perform them, but they're not our normal movement patterns. If you have to create a machine or a device to do the actual movement under load, it could be problematic. So again, most cable exercises and most machine exercises aren't. Now, I'm not saying they don't build hypertrophy, but they're not necessarily ideal for performance or balance musculature. Because again, you have to have a device to do it, such as a leg extension machine, right? There's no normal action we would do that would replicate the strength curve on that, or where we would even isolate the quads. Almost every movement in which you use the quads explosively or for strength in any environment, whether it's kicking, jumping, sprinting, right? All these different things, it involves a hip hinge. It involves a hip hinge. And what we need to remember is that machines take certain stabilizers out and they lock us into unnormal movement patterns. So what I would say is normal movement patterns. Any normal full body exercise you could do would qualify. And it's just we need to have a way to load it and to load it against gravity. So perfect example, a squat of any type, right? I don't care whether it's a high bar, low bar, front squat, a squat. No matter what bar you use, a squat is a normal movement pattern. Right? And when you add resistance, you're still just adding your resistance against gravity more than your body weight. And it's a body weight exercise. These are the easiest ones to think of because these make total sense. Body weight exercises, any exercise that you can either just do standing with your body weight, or to where you can grab on to a pole or a bar, which could be just like a limb on a tree or anything else, stuff that we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, and pull yourself up or push yourself up on it, then where you can just load extra resistance. Through any means that you can, meaning you're just adding weight to a normal movement pattern. So perfect examples, any sort of squat, any sort of deadlift, any sort of dip, pull up, chin up, right? These are functional in the sense of these are normal movement patterns. People say, where would you squat? Well, most jumping is a squat. When you sit down to take a crap, that's a squat. I mean, all through history, before we had told us the way that we do, people just had to squat in a deep squat every time they wanted to go to the bathroom. It's a normal movement pattern that we are well designed to do, and it's perfectly safe if done correctly. And these are the movement patterns that, again, if performed correctly, tend to have the lowest injury risk because we spread the load over multiple joints and tendons. And the more you try to isolate something, sometimes the more unnatural it becomes and actually has its own propensity for injury risk. So those all count. So again, anything like that, which you don't need a machine. Now some people say, well, don't you need racks to get the weights out of to do an overhead press or a squat? Yeah, you do, but the movement pattern itself is normal and you're still doing it against gravity. You're doing it against gravity. Whether you're grabbing a dumbbells or a barbell or whatever you happen to be grabbing, it's still dead weight against gravity in the same strength curve that you would have anywhere historically in any normal movement pattern. It's the exact same strength curve, as you're just adding resistance against gravity. You're adding more to your body weight, things like that. So those are the easiest ones. Now, where it starts to get a little ambiguous, people would say, well, what about a bench press? You need a special bench to lay on. And that's kind of an interesting one. And I think we could almost argue because of that. And this is going to, a lot of purists are going to say, oh my God. And people are going to say, Jason, I thought you're into this functional type training and yet you bench press 6 days a week. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. But I'll be the first to admit there are better exercises. As far as better exercises go, I think that the weighted dip is a superior exercise to the bench press. It absolutely is, but here's the thing. We don't have strength standards for the dip compared to the bench press. If anyone wants to go compete in powerlifting, they're going to have to bench press. You know, if powerlifting did away with the bench and added something else, that would be fine. I'd be fine with it. And we have a cultural stigma towards it. So the bench press is one of those exercises that I recommend, that I do, again, purely because I'm a fitness guy who promotes strength. I can't walk around having a weak bench press. It's just not good for my marketing. It's not, to be honest here. And if I ever want to compete in powerlifting again, I better have a good bench press. Also, I've said that, we have strength standards for 6 different lifts. They're easily available with strength and conditioning charts and everything. I think most people need to develop a strength base. If you want to be considered strong or be considered to be athletic, you should probably have a strength base in all 6 of those basic movement patterns. That does include the squat, bench, deadlift. That includes the snatch, the clean, the strict press, right? Those are normal movement patterns. Also, all of them are really functional exercises, again, barring maybe the bench press, but that doesn't mean you can't do dips on top of it. And again, it comes down to an ego thing among men. We're judged on our bench press. Other men, how much do you bench? How much do you bench? So because we've got that cultural stigma, we have strength standards for it, we have competitiveness for it. I still bench press. I still recommend the bench press. But if we really want to talk about a more functional, more effective movement, I would say that weighted dips are a better exercise. They're simply more functional. They bring more muscle mass into play. And that's a big part of it. And that's one of the defining characteristics also that we need to understand. A functional movement means you use as many muscles as possible to perform that basic movement pattern in a way that doesn't hurt you. In other words, the more muscle mass and more muscles in your body you can recruit at the same time, the more that carries over to sports type activities, survival situations, fights, anything, right? So that's where another way we could define it. The more muscle mass you can bring into it to do that movement pattern, because that's normal. Humans compensate. We use compensatory strength. Compensatory strength. I'm sorry, guys. My pronunciation's off today. So by that same token, when you can bring other muscles in, it makes sense. And a perfect example, it's not good to isolate muscles. And when you start thinking about, say, the bicep, let's say you want to curl. There's a reason a lot of guys with massive arms don't strict curl. I'm just throwing it out there. Because a strict curl isn't a normal movement pattern in the bicep. Yeah, it'll perform that, but you have to focus on it. You have to force it to. That can tend to, in my experience, lead to more connective tissue inflammation. For me, someone who's torn a bicep, I absolutely notice that. Too much strict curling of any type, and I get inflammation in that old injured tendon. Because again, it's putting not the correct stretch on it. It's not loading the weight across enough joints and tendons. And when you think about what is the bicep really good at, what movement is the bicep ever used for? Chinning yourself up, pulling yourself up, right? And when that happens, the bicep is designed to work under extension of the shoulder also. It involves deltoids, it involves trapezius, it involves other muscles. So, a perfect example, a curl, the way a lot of these guys, again, go back to the thing I said about C.T. Fletcher. Notice what C.T. Fletcher does. He performs almost a cheat curl where he comes up, he comes all the way down, but, your torso's back a little bit so that you can keep the bar somewhat mid-foot, and you chin it up. And there's extension of there. And I've had to come around long term on that. I used to have a different mentality on that. I used to say, no, you guys should be curling straight. You're taking tension off. Continual tension has never been found to produce hypertrophy. So why would it matter? In this case, you're involving other muscles. You're turning it into a compound movement. That is actually what the bicep does. Your bicep isn't really even intended, when you look at the way we do different movement patterns, it doesn't work in isolation any more than the quads do. So technically, that's the way the bicep works best, is to have that shoulder extension. That's the reason it is so heavily recruited when you do a chin-up, because you're doing multiple functions of the bicep, the way that it's intended to work. It's not just flexing and extending the elbow, or really flexing the elbow. There's extension of the shoulder involved. So again, one reason chin-ups are so effective for biceps when done through a full range of motion, because you have that extra movement there, that joint. And the same thing when you curl. I mean, that's a perfect example. That is a more functional exercise than trying to curl strict. It absolutely is. And it shouldn't hurt your lower back if you set your hips and everything correctly. So this is what we come down to. The same thing, we start talking about isolating the triceps. People want to do tricep extensions, but when you extend the shoulder joint, when you do the skull crushers a certain way and then you bring it forward when you're laying down, what ends up happening? It ends up recruiting more muscle fibers through the tricep. The long head gets more engaged because, again, muscles aren't intended to be isolated. They're not. They're absolutely not. So, again, when we're talking about being functional, is are we replicating normal human movement patterns and just loading them, and are we involving as many muscles as possible? So, I mean, some people say, well, squat, what about a hack squat machine? Couldn't we do that? Well, you're taking a lot of stabilizers out. You're taking out a lot of muscles just to put more focus on the legs. So we're back to not a normal movement pattern because you have bracing and everything for the back. And it tends to be a different curve. It's not against gravity, just like a cable isn't against gravity. That's not a normal movement pattern. You know, people came up with this idea for the machines and cables that we wanted more tension because we're stronger at certain angles and we can maintain a more consistent tension. Well, that's not the way that our muscles work. That's not the way that our muscles work in their normal movement patterns. And what ends up happening, how many people out there who do tons and tons of all this cable stuff and machine stuff, they always have inflamed tendons. They're always having to wrap stuff. You don't see as much of that for people who train with good technique on big, heavy barbell movements and weighted bodyweight exercises. It actually seems to be lower incidence in my experience over the years. So take that for what it's worth. That's somewhat anecdote. But again, it comes back to the point of more functional movements that leave you in your normal movement patterns that involve more muscles tend to create a situation where you get less overuse injuries. You get less inflammation because loads are spread more evenly through the body. They're spread across more joints, more tendons. And because you involve more muscles, you not only gain more total muscle mass, you train your body to use those muscles more in conjunction, which will carry over to sports, to fighting, to running, to jumping, to all these other situations in which we think of as being athletic things. It simply has better carryover. So that's what we're talking about, or at least me personally. When I say a functional exercise, this is what I mean by it. And some exercises are more functional than others. So instead of just saying an exercise is functional versus not functional, maybe think of it as a sliding scale. And that would be the way to look at it. Functional meaning, are you loading normal movement patterns versus not loading normal movement patterns? Do you need special devices designed to create this movement pattern and strength curve versus can you do it with just a dead weight? And, you know, does it involve more muscles through the body or fewer muscles through the body? So those sort of criteria are what you could use to kind of put it on that scale. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.